war was supposed to be over. But when Captain Thomas Hughes discovers a wounded enemy officer, none other than the daughter of the general who betrayed his people, his world is turned upside down. With his loyal dog, Grunt, leading the way, Thomas faces an impossible choice: save her life or let her die. But as danger closes in, a shocking truth unfolds. The real enemy isn't who they thought, and both sides are being manipulated into a war they can't win. Can Thomas trust an enemy soldier to stop a greater threat before it's too late? Time is running out, and the fate of both worlds rests on the fragile bond between them. Will they be able to expose the truth before it's too late? If you're new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. The wreckage of the colony sprawled out like a broken puzzle, pieces of what was once a thriving settlement scattered across the desolate landscape. The once vibrant structures of New Eden Colony now stood as twisted remnants, scarred by the brutality of war. Captain Thomas Hughes stood still, his boots crunching over the shattered crystals that had once been the beautiful buildings of a peaceful world. The air was thick with the acrid stench of plasma discharge and burning metal. It was a smell that haunted him, a reminder of the battles that had come and gone, leaving destruction in their wake. His loyal German shepherd, Grunt, stood silently, at his side, his nose twitching as he scanned the surroundings. Grunt had been more than just a dog. He had been Thomas's companion through countless battles, offering both protection and companionship in the chaos of war. The dog's keen senses had saved Thomas's life more than once, and today, as they made their way through the wreckage, Thomas was more grateful than ever for the dog's presence. What a damn waste, Thomas muttered under his breath, his voice thick with frustration. The war had taken so much, leaving behind nothing but ruin. The Saruan forces had once been allies, partners in a joint effort to establish a colony on the mineral-rich planet of Orson. But now, greed and politics had torn them apart, turning them into bitter enemies. Thomas couldn't help but wonder how it had all gone so wrong. The battle had been brief, a surgical strike aimed at reclaiming the part of the colony that had been taken over by the Saruan forces just a few months ago. It had been a necessary strike, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that it had been a wasted effort. So much destruction for what? A few acres of land? For a few more minerals? There had to be a better way. Grunt's ears perked up, pulling Thomas from his thoughts. The dog was focused, his attention drawn to something in the distance. Thomas glanced over, squinting against the harsh sunlight as he tried to see what had caught the dog's attention. Before he could react, Grunt darted off, weaving between the twisted metal and debris. "Grunt, get back here," Thomas called out, but the dog ignored him, its instincts leading it forward. Thomas cursed under his breath, his hand instinctively going to the sidearm holstered at his hip. He knew better than to question Grunt when the dog's senses were on alert. If Grunt was going after something, it was worth investigating. He sprinted after the dog, his heart pounding in his chest as he moved through the rubble. He rounded a corner, his boots kicking up dust as he came to a sudden stop. There, lying half-buried beneath the wreckage, was a figure. Grunt stood over it, gently licking what appeared to be an alien's hand. The dog's tail wagged in slow, steady movements as if he were comforting the injured creature. "What the hell is this?" Thomas whispered under his breath, his voice laced with disbelief. He had been prepared to find enemy soldiers' bodies from the battle, but this was something entirely different. The figure lying in the debris was not human. She was tall and slim, with smooth blue skin that shimmered faintly in the light. Her long, bright blue hair cascaded around her like a river of water, a striking contrast to the dark, ruined landscape. She was wearing a torn metallic suit, the fabric stained with silvery blood. Thomas knelt down, his eyes widening as he saw the insignia on her collar. This wasn't just any soldier. No way, Thomas muttered to himself, recognition dawning on him. This was Lieutenant Atria Theox, the daughter of General Theo, a well-known figure among their ranks. Atria was one of the most prominent leaders in the Saruan military, and yet here she was, half dead in the rubble of her own people's destruction. He reached out, checking her pulse. To his surprise, she was still alive, but barely. Her breathing was shallow and her skin was cold to the touch. Thomas could see the faint signs of her wounds healing, but it was clear she needed immediate medical attention. His mind raced as he tried to process the situation. This was not supposed to happen. The Saruman forces had been the enemy. He couldn't just leave her here to die, but what choice did he have? She had been part of the enemy army, part of the forces that had torn this colony apart. Yet something inside him urged him to help her. He had seen enough death for one lifetime, and as much as he hated to admit it, he knew there was more to this than just a simple act of war. There was something in the way Grunt had reacted, in the way the dog had stayed by her side. It was almost as if Grunt knew she wasn't his enemy. Damn it, Thomas muttered, making a decision that would change everything. If my dog trusts you, maybe I can trust you too. He carefully lifted her into his arms, surprised by how light she felt despite her tall frame. Grunt led the way, trotting ahead with his usual steady gait, as if he knew exactly what needed to be done. The whole situation felt surreal, like something out of a dream. Here he was, carrying the daughter of the man who had betrayed his people, the enemy of his world. And yet, he felt no anger, no hatred, only a deep sense of responsibility. As he made his way back to the ship, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this decision was bigger than just saving one life. Something had shifted like the first pebble in an avalanche, and he couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Would he regret this? He hoped not, but he couldn't know for sure. One thing was certain. He had made a choice, and there was no turning back now. The soft hum of the ship's engines greeted them as they boarded, and Thomas knew that whatever happened next, his life would never be the same. The soft whir of the Phoenix's engines filled the air as Captain Thomas Hughes moved through the narrow hallways carrying the unconscious Lieutenant Atria Theox to the med bay. Grunt walked beside him, his ears back, nose twitching as he seemed to sense the tension that filled the air. Thomas could feel it too, the weight of the situation pressing down on him with each step. He had never expected to find himself in this position, carrying an injured enemy officer aboard his ship against all his training and instincts. He had been taught to follow orders, to see the enemy as just that, the enemy. But now, with Atria lying unconscious in his arms, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't as simple as they seemed. The war, the betrayals, the endless conflict. It all felt so meaningless now. And yet, here he was, doing something he never imagined he would do, saving the life of someone who had been a part of the forces that had destroyed his world. Grunt, as if sensing his internal struggle, nudged Thomas's hand with his nose, as though offering comfort. It was strange how a dog, an animal that had no understanding of the intricacies of politics or war, could be the one to lead the way. Maybe that's what Thomas needed right now. A simple, honest ally who could see past the hatred and bloodshed. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't about sides. It was about doing what was right. As he entered the med bay, Thomas carefully laid Atria down on the medical table, his hands gentle despite the circumstances. The ship's advanced medical equipment sprang to life, humming softly as it began to scan her vitals. Thomas couldn't help but notice the way her blue skin shimmered faintly under the sterile lights, as if it was somehow alive in a way that he couldn't fully understand. The ship's AI spoke in its usual calm tone. Injuries detected, severe lacerations to the abdomen, plasma burns on the limbs, head trauma, initiating regeneration protocol. Thanks, Thomas muttered absently, watching as the medical equipment worked to patch up the worst of her wounds. He stepped back, giving her space while the ship's systems did their work. Grunt settled down on the floor beside the bed, watching Atria with a quiet intensity. The dog had never left her side, even when she was unconscious, and Thomas had a feeling that Grunt knew more than he did about the situation. He couldn't explain it, but there was something about this woman, this enemy, that made him question everything he had believed. The soldiers he had fought alongside had been taught to fear the Saruman people, to see them as nothing more than obstacles in the way of peace. But now that he was face to face with one of them, he could see her differently. She wasn't just a soldier. She was a person with hopes, fears, and a past that had led her to this very moment. A few minutes passed before Atria's eyes fluttered open, her gaze blurry and unfocused. When she finally registered where she was, her entire body stiffened in panic. She tried to sit up, but pain shot through her body, causing her to wince. Thomas stepped forward, his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "Take it easy," he said gently, his voice calm and steady. "You're on my ship. You're safe now." Atria's blue eyes narrowed, her sharp oceanic gaze cutting through the haze of pain. She tried to push herself off the bed, but her strength faltered. "Why are you helping me?" Her voice was hoarse, but there was an edge of suspicion in her words. Thomas hesitated, unsure of how to answer. What could he say? That he wasn't following orders? That he simply couldn't leave her to die, even though she was his enemy? Instead, he just shrugged, his voice quiet but firm. "Because you needed help. You were dying out there, and I couldn't just leave you." Atria's lips curled into a bitter smile. "I'm your enemy," she spat, her voice filled with incredulity. "Why would you save me? Why would any human help someone like me?" Thomas could see the anger, the confusion in her eyes, and he understood. He had been raised to see the Saruan as enemies, as the other side of a war that had claimed so much. But standing here in the quiet med bay with her, he couldn't see her as just a soldier. She was someone who had been caught in the same web of conflict, a victim of the same senseless war. It wasn't her fault that the leaders of their respective races had dragged them into this mess. Because, Thomas said slowly, carefully choosing his words, sometimes the enemy isn't who we think it is. Sometimes the enemy is just a person trying to survive just like we are. There was a long silence as Atria absorbed his words. She looked down at her hands, still trembling from the pain and the shock of the situation. "I don't trust you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't trust humans." Grunt, who had been sitting by quietly, suddenly rose to his feet and padded over to Atria's side. Without hesitation, the dog placed his head gently on her lap, looking up at her with those knowing brown eyes. Atria's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the dog, unsure of what to make of this unexpected gesture. "Grunt knows," Thomas said, watching the two interact. "He's better at judging character than I am." Atria's expression softened for a moment as she ran her fingers through Grunt's fur. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. In that moment, the tension between them seemed to lessen just a little. "I don't understand," Atria said, her voice quieter now. "You're risking everything to help me. Why?" Thomas looked at her, his expression serious. "Because I think there's more to this war than we're being told. I think both our sides have been manipulated into fighting each other, and I don't want to be a part of that anymore." Atria stared at him for a long time, her gaze intense. "And what if you're wrong? What if helping me puts everything at risk?" "Then we deal with it together," Thomas said simply. "But I don't believe in leaving people behind, not anymore." The silence stretched between them as Atria considered his words. It was a delicate moment, one that could go either way. But something in Thomas's voice, something in the way Grunt remained at her side, seemed to reach her. Slowly, hesitantly, Atria nodded. "I'll trust you. For now." It wasn't much, but it was a start. And as Thomas turned to leave the medbay, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something much bigger than he could ever have imagined. Out in the quiet of space, the Phoenix drifted forward, carrying its unlikely passengers toward a future that neither of them could predict. But one thing was certain: they weren't alone anymore. The quiet hum of the Phoenix's engines was a constant presence, filling the air with a soft vibration that resonated deep in Thomas Hughes's bones. His eyes remained focused on the glowing data screens in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. The encounter with Atria Theox had left him unsettled, like a puzzle missing a piece. Every time he tried to dismiss the event, the image of her, blue skin and piercing oceanic eyes returned to him, reminding him of how much he still didn't understand about this war, how much he didn't understand about himself either. He was no stranger to difficult decisions, to facing the consequences of his choices. But this was different. He had always followed orders, trusted in the system. But as the Phoenix sailed through the dark void of space, a new truth settled in his chest. The war wasn't as clear-cut as he had been led to believe. He had been taught to see the Saruan as enemies, as cold, ruthless invaders. But now that he had saved Atria's life, he couldn't help but question that narrative. She was a soldier, yes, but she was also a person who had been forced into a fight she might not have chosen. The soft sound of paws padding on metal interrupted his thoughts. Grunt entered the cockpit, his eyes locking onto Thomas, with that ever-present calm intelligence that Thomas had grown to rely on. The dog's tail wagged lazily, his way of greeting his owner without words. Thomas smiled faintly and scratched behind Grunt's ears. "What do you think, boy?" Thomas murmured, his voice more to himself than to his companion. "Am I doing the right thing?" Grunt simply panted, as though acknowledging Thomas's inner turmoil without judgment. But in the back of his mind, Thomas couldn't help but think that Grunt knew more than he did about this whole situation. The dog's instincts had always been spot on. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was one of those moments where he could trust his loyal friend's judgment over his own. Meanwhile, in the med bay, Atria was still recovering from the injuries she had sustained. Thomas had done what he could to make her comfortable, but the trust between them had not yet fully formed. She was still on edge, her warrior instincts running high, and it was clear that she wasn't quite ready to accept her new reality. Not yet. Thomas had been careful not to push her too much, understanding that a person, especially a soldier, needed time to adjust to such drastic changes. A sudden alert broke the stillness, echoing through the quiet ship. Thomas glanced at the control panel, seeing a red warning light flashing urgently. He quickly tapped a series of commands into the ship's console, bringing up the tactical display. "What the hell?" he muttered to himself, his eyes scanning the data. Several ships were approaching. They didn't appear to be human. Their patterns were too erratic, their course too direct. "Admiral, we have incoming," Thomas said, activating the communication system to contact the ship's commanding officer, General Aldrich. The general's gruff voice crackled over the speakers almost immediately. "What is it, Captain?" "Unknown ships, sir. They're approaching fast. It doesn't look like a standard patrol, and their trajectory is suspicious. Keep your distance. I'll scramble a fighter squadron," General Aldrich replied before cutting the communication. As the ship continued on its course, Thomas could feel the tension creeping into his bones. The ships were getting closer, and the feeling that something was wrong settled in the pit of his stomach. He stood, his instincts kicking into high gear. It was time to prepare for what might be an ambush. In the med bay, Atria stirred, her eyes slowly opening. The dull ache of her injuries still lingered, but there was an underlying strength in her gaze. She had been quiet since her outburst earlier, and now her gaze was focused, almost calculating, as if she was piecing together the situation in her mind. Thomas stepped into the med bay, his face tense with concern. "Get up, Lieutenant," he said, his voice sharp. "We have a situation." Atria looked up, her ocean blue eyes narrowing as she processed his words. She attempted to sit up, but the pain from her injuries forced her to wince. Despite this, she managed to push through, her warrior spirit refusing to let her remain passive. Thomas walked over and extended a hand to help her. "I don't need your help," she muttered through clenched teeth. Though there was less hostility in her voice now, it was clear that her pride was still intact. But Thomas could see the change. She wasn't just the enemy anymore. She was someone who had survived, who had been through things that were beyond her control. And in that moment, Thomas realized something important. Their shared struggle had begun to form a connection between them. "You're gonna need it," Thomas replied, his voice gentle but firm. "We don't know who's out there or what they want. I need you to help me figure this out." Atria hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Fine," she said, her voice softening slightly. "But don't think this means I trust you." "Trust takes time," Thomas said, offering a half smile. "But we'll get there." The ship rocked slightly as the unknown vessels came closer, The tension in the air thickened and both Thomas and Atria moved quickly to the ship's tactical command station. Thomas worked with practiced precision, bringing up the ship's shields and weapon systems. Atria watched him, her gaze sharp and calculating as she assessed the situation. "I know what you're thinking," Thomas said, not looking at her. "You want to fight, but we don't know who these ships belong to. We can't just start shooting without knowing the full picture." Atria's lips curved into a slight smile, though there was no humor in it. "You humans are always so cautious, but you're right. There's something off about this. If these ships are enemy forces, they've been made to look like our own." Thomas turned to face her. "How do you know that?" Atria stepped forward, her expression hardening. "The signature patterns, the fluctuations in the energy readings. It's a masking technology. Synthetic energy. It's designed to mimic our ships, but it's unstable. Whoever is controlling these ships is trying to deceive both sides. They want to provoke us into a battle before we can figure out who they really are." Thomas's heart skipped a beat. The thought that they might be being played by a third party sent a chill down his spine. But what could the unknown force possibly want? The answer came too quickly. "We have to stop them," Thomas said, his voice urgent. "If these ships provoke us into attacking, it could lead to a war between humans and Ceruleans. We have to expose them for who they really are." Atria's expression softened for a brief moment, and for the first time, Thomas saw something resembling respect in her eyes. "I'm with you," she said simply. Just as the ships closed in on them, Thomas made a decision. He would face whatever this was, and he wouldn't do it alone. For the first time, he wasn't just a soldier following orders. He was an ally to someone who had once been the enemy. And maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward a larger truth. A new chapter had begun, not just for Thomas and Atria, but for the future of their people. The next few moments would define everything. The stars outside the Phoenix flickered like distant lights on a dark, uncertain path. The calm of space felt almost eerie, given the storm that was brewing within the ship. Captain Thomas Hughes stood at the tactical station, his mind racing through the possibilities. He had always been able to handle pressure, but this was different. His decisions now not only impacted his crew and his mission, but could change the course of an entire, or the unknown ships were closing in fast. Thomas had no time to waste. He turned to Atria, her blue skin still tinged with the effects of her earlier injuries, but her gaze was sharp, and her posture, though bruised, was defiant. She had become more than just a wounded soldier. She was now an ally, one he wasn't sure he fully understood yet, but one he knew he needed. "I'll need your help to get us through this," Thomas said, his voice steady. Atria nodded without hesitation, her eyes narrowing as she studied the approaching ships on the tactical display. "I know how to read this tech," Atria said, her voice low and focused. "If they're using synthetic crystals to mask their signature, I can track them, but we'll need to act fast." Grunt, who had been quietly observing from the corner, stood up and walked over to Thomas's side, as if ready for whatever came next. Thomas placed a hand on the dog's head, appreciating the quiet support. Grunt had been more than just a dog. He was an extension of Thomas's own instincts, and in moments like this, that bond felt more vital than ever. "All right, here's the plan," Thomas said, taking a deep breath. "We need to get closer to them, draw their attention, and lure them into range. We can't just sit here waiting to be targeted. We've got to take control." Atria didn't flinch at his words. "You're not wrong," she said, her tone surprisingly calm given the situation. "But we'll need a distraction, something that will make them think we're an easy target." Thomas nodded. He was already pulling up the ship's weaponry system, configuring it for a display of force. "I'll simulate a malfunction in our engines," he said, working quickly. "They'll think we're disabled. We use that to get close and disable their masking tech. Once we do that, we can reveal them for who they are." "Perfect," Atria said, her voice filled with approval. "Let me adjust the shields to give us an edge if things go south." As Thomas worked, he couldn't help but glance at Atria. Despite the chaos around them, there was something undeniably captivating about her. Her blue skin shimmered faintly under the low lights of the Phoenix, and her movements, though still careful, had an air of grace that betrayed her warrior background. She was far from the cold enemy he had once imagined. She was human, in a way, and it was that realization that made everything more complicated. The hum of the ship's engines grew louder as the ships on the display neared. Thomas had made the decision to play the part of a vulnerable target, but as he looked at Atria, he knew that their partnership, however fragile, was their best chance. "All right," Thomas said, stepping back from the console. "Let's do this." With a deep breath, Thomas activated the simulation, sending a burst of static through the ship's communication system. The Phoenix shuddered slightly, and the screen in front of them flickered, displaying the false image of a ship on the verge of a system's failure. He knew that the incoming ships would see it as an opportunity, one they couldn't resist. The first volley came seconds later. Laser beams cracked through the emptiness of space, targeting the Phoenix as expected. Thomas gritted his teeth, watching the shields flare up in response. The hit wasn't devastating, but it was enough to confirm that their enemies were taking the bait. The real trick was now to get them to close the distance, to get them close enough for Atria to do her part. "Get ready," Thomas said, his voice tense. "They're moving in. When they get close, you need to activate the pulse. We have one shot at this." Atria moved swiftly, her fingers dancing over the controls with an elegance that surprised him. She had been a soldier all her life, but there was a calm about her now, as if the chaos of battle had become second nature. She wasn't just reacting, she was leading. And Thomas found himself following her, trusting her instincts as much as his own. "Almost there," Atria said, her voice steady. "Pulse ready, just say the word." The enemy ships were nearly in range. Thomas could feel his heart pounding in his chest as the seconds ticked down. This was it. One mistake, one misstep, and everything would fall apart. He had to trust Atria, and for the first time he realized that he did. He fully trusted her. "Now," he shouted. With a quick motion, Atria activated the pulse, sending a shockwave of energy toward the enemy fleet. The synthetic masking technology of the approaching ships flickered for a split second, enough time for Thomas to catch the telltale signs of their true identities. They weren't Saruan ships at all. "Confirmed," Thomas said, his voice firm. "They're imposters. These aren't Saruan forces." The ships faltered, their masking technology glitching out completely as the energy pulse disrupted their systems. The truth was laid bare in an instant. The ships that had been targeting them were not from the Saruan fleet. They were a third-party force, using advanced technology to mimic the signature of their enemies and push both sides into a war. "Now we can expose them," Thomas said, his voice now filled with determination. "Let's finish this." Atria's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as she began inputting new commands, targeting the enemy ships with precise accuracy. "We need to take out their engines and communications," she said, her tone cold and methodical. "Once we disable their ability to communicate, we'll have the upper hand." The Phoenix's weapon systems hummed to life, and the first blast hit one of the imposter ships. The explosion was controlled just enough to send a clear message. "Stop this now or you'll regret it," Thomas said under his breath as the holographic displays lit up with incoming data. The enemy ships, now exposed and vulnerable, attempted to retaliate. But it was too late. The Phoenix's superior firepower quickly disabled their weapon systems, and the cloaking tech that had hidden their true nature was destroyed. In a matter of minutes, the ships were disabled, their attempts to flee blocked by the Phoenix's well-placed shots. "Target neutralized," Atria reported, her eyes still locked on the displays. "They won't be going anywhere," Thomas let out, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Nice work," he said, turning to her. There was a newfound respect in his gaze, something deeper than just admiration for her skills. Atria looked back at him, her eyes softening slightly. "We did it together," she said, the edge of her voice fading into something more personal. Just as Thomas was about to speak, Grunt let out a low bark, his tail wagging as he trotted over to Atria's side. The bond between the three of them had deepened in ways none of them could have predicted. What had started as a fragile alliance was now something more solid. Thomas could feel it, the shift between them. They weren't just two sides of a conflict anymore. They were allies. Friends even. As the Phoenix cruised past the disabled ships, Thomas stood tall, his gaze fixed on the stars ahead. They had uncovered the truth and stopped an enemy that had been playing both sides. But more than that, they had proved that even in the darkest of circumstances, trust and loyalty could still emerge. And sometimes the greatest battles were won not with weapons, but with the courage to do what was right. "We've changed the course of this war," Thomas said quietly as the ship sped toward the next challenge. But deep down, he knew the real change wasn't just in the war. It was in the three of them. And whatever came next, they would face it together.